Alright, now we have what I'm basically treating as the companion video to the Wolf and Bad Moon video, since we're still using this 4-pack DVD, but now we're going to Body Snatchers, and I was kind of thinking about this when I was putting this list together of all these verses, and obviously another thing, there's a few things I could have done with Abel Ferrara's Body Snatchers, which would be the other Invasion of the Body Snatchers movies, like Don Siegel's movie from like the 50s with Kevin McCarthy, and then the 70s one by Philip Kaufman with Donald Sutherland. But I also kind of thought like those will probably end up being done together at some point, probably, assuming I'm still doing this for however long. So I kind of wanted to not only stay in the decade of the 90s like we did with Wolf and Bad Moon, but also the idea of taking something like a Ferrara approach to a movie, where Ferrara's one of those directors that even though this kind of seems like totally out of his wheelhouse, but also kind of not when you really look at it, in the way that he's a director that like tends to go to like the darkest depths of where humans can go. I kind of wanted to see what a different side of that would be, so to go to something that's a bit more, certainly not light necessarily, but something that's a bit more, has like that self-aware quality to it that obviously Kevin Williamson is going to bring to a script. And of course, Williamson wrote this like right consecutively with, it was Scream, and then Scream 2, and then this pretty much right in a row. It is to my understanding that, if I'm not misremembering or thinking of something else, that it was actually like an original script by like 2 other guys, and then it was Weinstein that brought in Kevin Williamson to basically rewrite it entirely, to the point that Williamson's the sole credited writer. But you definitely get him all over this, and that whole self-referential quality all over this. So that's kind of why I chose these 2, I think, and I've just kind of been wanting to talk about The Faculty for a while, because The Faculty is amazing. But, and so is Body Snatchers. So, I guess to start here, we can talk about just the settings in which these movies choose as far as using this concept of these hostile aliens coming down to Earth and taking over our bodies by way of pods. And it's a little different than the pod thing in The Faculty, but it still kind of stays in that area of choosing the setting very carefully, as far as like the school setting feels pretty perfect to me, because obviously a school is going to be a place where people tend to hide themselves and not necessarily, like, they might kind of put a wall up and use maybe a different personality to maybe get by, or to the way they interact with other people, or how we can kind of take certain aspects of others' personalities when we're this young and we're still kind of developing our own personalities. And there's something where we're not quite ourselves a lot of the time at school. At least that's how I remember it mostly. Not just, myself, but a lot of other people. But actually, the way I felt about that comes much more into how I view Body Snatchers. But we'll get into that. But yeah, but I guess you could also see it as the way that the aliens initially start to take over the teachers first, before they kind of start getting to the students. So we start with, like, Robert Patrick and Piper Laurie and, Famke Janssen and Bebe Neuwirth and all that. And looking at it from the perspective of our main characters, you can look at it as, like, this sort of fear of authority, I guess. Especially when you're that age. And, like, an adult can pretty much say anything to you, and you'll kind of, like, cower into submission. But there's also the whole concept itself of fighting back, and the idea of, like, rebelling against authority. It could be something like this, where it has to be the students versus the teachers for a particular reason. But you could look at it that way. So I feel like the school setting really works for this. And then you come over to Body Snatchers, which has the military base setting. And I know some people thought this was a little on the nose, but I kind of feel like that's appropriate. Because it's so, like, it's one of those cases where it feels on the nose because it feels so obvious, yet this concept had not tackled that territory yet. So it's like, why not do it this way? Where you do have, you have the whole military thing where it's, everybody's wearing the same thing, they have the same haircuts, they go through the same routines, they speak in unison. Everything about this, and the whole idea of like once you're in the military, there's this sort of sacrifice of individuality. Yeah, I honestly also can't think of a more perfect place to have this setting, and where you can't quite differentiate what might be out of place. And as far as like what it's saying about that in general, as far as like a message of sorts, that's something also you can go into, because there is, when you read into it, there's a lot of interpretations when it comes to not just, the Body Snatcher story in general, but Ferrara's movie here specifically. There was, like, with the timing, I've heard comparisons to the AIDS epidemic it could be an allegory for. There's the idea of it using, like, sex and nudity more than most, and the idea of it being this, like, fear but also desire of women. Which would make sense because, Ferrara made Miss 45, which if you haven't seen, I also highly recommend. I've heard that, and I'm not saying I subscribe to any of these, I'm just saying these are the ones that are out there that I've read about. There's the fact that when they use the tentacles and the way they violate the body as they're taking over and creating a clone, that's been compared to rape, to my understanding, and the idea of, like, once that has happened to you, you become a shell of yourself, like, as seen here. And all of those, I think you could really delve into and make a whole sort of allegory about and follow that direction as far as this movie goes. Or you really could also just follow it as a horror movie or a sci-fi movie or whatever. But as far as seeing it, like, seeing another side to it, like a more, like, you have the horror sci-fi elements and, that story in itself, but there is always going to be, like, this sort of real life that's bleeding into it that you can feel it mirrors in an eerie kind of way. And honestly, to me, it's really just, as somebody that was essentially born, I guess, with crippling social anxiety, and I don't say that, like, lightly or throwaway, that's kind of what I lean towards, where it's like the idea of just not, basically everybody being a stranger in one sense or another. Even people you've maybe known your entire life. Like think about, like, there's a lot of focus on family in the Ferrara movie. So looking at it from, like, the perspective of, oh, well, you know your parents your whole life. But at the same time, your parents had a whole other life before you even existed. And so it's like, yeah, you know these people as the parent, but how much is there that you don't know, even with the people that are really, really close to you. And then even when you, like, meet new friends or meet new love interests, both things that happen in this movie, it's always that question of, where exactly does this person come from? You're never really know 100%, regardless of how well you get to know somebody, so in a way, there's always going to be a stranger aspect to the people that are the absolute closest to you. And that in itself is terrifying, and I feel like we're kind of exploring that kind of territory. And like, we were talking about, like, the family aspect also of, like, I think it's especially brilliant to have this be a bit of a fractured family, not just in, like, the relationships themselves and how they feel about each other, but the fact that like, there's a combining of families here where we have the father and daughter, and then we have the new wife and the new stepbrother or stepson. And like I said, there's always going to be this distance here where you're never quite... There's always going to be this sense of, do we really know this person? And it's like, especially... That's why I think, the dating scene is terrifying, and why I tend to, keep that stuff as close-knit as I can, because it's like the idea of just going out and meeting somebody, and you see people meet people that are ready to get married in the span of, like, 6 months, and it's like the fact that you didn't know this person existed, like, less than a year ago is just kind of a terrifying thought to me. And like I said, that's where I feel like we're headed here, and, like, what the kind of setup as far as setting up where the horror of this is, the sort of human element of the horror in this. And that's also to look at, the characters themselves, because I do think we get more looks and depth in character as far as the faculty goes, as far as the individual characters, but I do think, like I said, as far as setting up the horror, where it sets up the idea of this family and the fact that they're kind of coming from different places, and there's already kind of a, I don't know if it's an untrustworthy factor, but it's not exactly a happy home. But also the idea of, like I said, meeting new friends, like, you know, when she meets Kyle from Child's Play 2, whose character name I've forgotten now. And there's that kind of bond there that's almost immediate. Here you have relationships that are pretty lived in when we start, because we're already, like, you know, sort of in the middle of the school year, and these are all people that already have sort of relationships, but they're also kind of at a distance also. Like, they're at a distance, but they know each other. Like, they know each other exists, and they've probably, you know, interacted throughout school and all that, but apart from that, you do get this sort of distance between them to where they all know each other, but there's also kind of a stranger aspect also, where it's kind of, throughout the movie, they're kind of getting to know each other more, which is what's intriguing about this. So it's like seeing that actual process play out almost in real time, of kind of knowing somebody but not really, then getting to know them, then growing an attachment, then they could not be what they appear to be. And we kind of see that play out in, like, its whole sort of thing throughout the faculty as we see the characters interacting. And just like I said, the individual characters also, I like how they kind of subvert expectations a little bit. Like, the fact that Zeke, the Josh Hartnett character, seems like he'd be the sort of, you know, slacker outcast, and he's doing, like, you know, illegal shit. He's making and distributing drugs and stuff like that. And the kind of twist on his character is that he's actually super smart. He's just not really applying it in the areas that he could be, that would be probably more beneficial to him in the long run. And kind of make that the sort of leader of this group, I feel like is a smart choice. And then there's Stan, the Sean Hannity character, who's like the football player, but he hates the idea of having, like, you know, the privileges of a football player, and just kind of wants to earn things for himself. And to see him go through this also, seeing the whole process, because I believe Zeke is the only one that doesn't get affected in one way or another. Casey at, like, the very last minute, but then obviously it's done by then. But like, to see Sean Hannity kind of get his Meg Tilly moment from Body Snatchers, where we see him as, like, you know, the sensitive, misunderstood guy, and then he also completely nails his moment towards the end after he's changed. And it's like, and to obviously compare that to the Meg Tilly scene, I do want to say that it might be hyperbolic, maybe, to throw this word around constantly like people tend to do, but I don't know if it would be an exaggeration to say that Meg Tilly in Body Snatchers is iconic. At least for the genre, at least for, like, sci-fi and horror, I would say this performance and her big moment are something you could say are iconic for the genres. And to have that carry over and have moments like this sort of throughout the faculty, where these characters have to reveal themselves in this really big way, and we kind of start to see... and those moments are great, I think, especially because both movies are great about building up the mystery behind it, where it's like, when you're watching Body Snatchers, you're, like, that whole idea of there being no sign of emotion being the tell. And it's like how you watch this movie so closely and the characters so closely, just looking for signs of emotion in these characters. And it's like, it makes you sort of suspicious and paranoid of everybody, and that's the kind of tone that needs to be set for this kind of story. Because you could say that the ambiguous ending of Body Snatchers could potentially be unsatisfying depending on the crowd, I guess. But I actually think... because I don't mind the faculty's sort of, you know, happy ending and that sort of mothership way of killing one and killing them all kind of thing. I actually don't really mind that, but I do think it's more appropriate to end a movie like this in the ambiguous way that Body Snatchers does, where it's like, because it doesn't really have to confirm anything necessarily. It's just, as long as it sets that paranoia in your mind effectively and it sticks, the movie's already done its job, and it's already pretty much made its point and put you in the place that you're supposed to be in, and what you're supposed to feel throughout this story. And so, like, it almost feels like you getting to that point, and it being a point of no return, is pretty much the movie and the story's finish line. So I can actually really appreciate how Body Snatchers ends in that way. Like I said, I could see it being frustrating for some, I guess. But another thing that these movies both use, as far as it being, really a sci-fi movie at its core, but obviously there's definitely horror qualities here, and the way that they use, like, horror imagery, that we recognize as horror imagery. Like, when you look at the opening of The Faculty, and how it almost feels like it starts like a slasher movie. Like, you can very much see the Kevin Williamson in it, that came from Scream and Scream 2 up to this point, and being able to open a movie like this. And then you go and you see, like, when Robert Patrick is standing in the sprinklers, and they look out the window at him, and it looks very much like the Michael Myers shot when Laurie Strode looks outside and sees Michael standing outside. There's the moment when they're all standing outside Casey's house, and they're just, like, dark figures, and it's like you can see, like, these horror elements come into it. And I love especially that Robert Patrick and Piper Laurie specifically seem to really like playing up the campy value of it. And Rodriguez also, with the like that really dramatic zoom in on Piper Laurie when it's become apparent what's going on. And what's really funny about that is that I feel like it's interesting that Robert Rodriguez directed this, because you can kind of feel like it was more of a director for hire kind of thing. And it certainly wasn't. He wasn't as devoted to this as he is to, like, his Mexico trilogy or all the other stuff, like Grindhouse, all that stuff that he puts everything into. And like how this is, you wouldn't think so if you were seeing this by itself, but how this is actually restrained Rodriguez. And so it's like to see Rodriguez kind of be in this territory where it feels like he's more of a director for hire, but there's still those elements in there. I also think it's interesting to compare to Ferrara, as far as, like, seeing him in this place that you just wouldn't normally as far as, like, how this movie feels surprisingly mainstream for his movies. And like I said, how his movies seem to be more about like the deepest depths of human emotion, and how dark the soul can go, is what it feels like a lot of his movies are, to me anyway. But to be able to bring this and make a story bring a story to life about the fact that the lack of human emotion is what's terrifying, and it's like being able to have those moments where you actually feel and you can actually emote is like this saving grace that you would never want to let go of. And like I said, and a world without it would just be absolutely terrifying. So I do feel like, as far as like seeing both of these directors kind of do something a little bit different, like I said, with Rodriguez, it more just feels like it's just him super restrained, which like I said, I know is a weird thing to say for a movie where a car crashes and Famke Janssen's head grows tentacles and starts crawling around. In our big action climax, where Mary Beth turns into the giant monster. Yeah, once again, I consider this restrained Rodriguez when you see the rest of Rodriguez. But talking about, because there's also those horror elements in Body Snatchers as well. That's another thing I wanted to go into about the kind of director Ferrara is, where you can see like even something like I brought up Miss 45 earlier. I guess to keep going on that, there is something where even though that movie is coming from a certain direction, it still kind of feels like it has the vibe of a slasher movie, just a slasher movie with a gun. So it does feel like that Ferrara has been in horror territory, for sure. Maybe not in the traditional sense, but he's definitely been in that territory many times. But the idea of seeing like these, like I said, these horror scenes as we recognize horror, like the gas station warning, which is like one of the big, horror tropes, is at the very start of Body Snatchers. Before you even have time to breathe, it's at the beginning of Body Snatchers where she gets, cornered in the bathroom and is warned. And it's even more aggressive than usual. We also get really just the idea of setting up the fear of sleep, where they talk about in the opening narration about how when this happens, it happens in your sleep, and how that can give you this sort of like going back to slasher movies, what A Nightmare on Elm Street set up, where the idea of being afraid to go to sleep, being a whole thing, this thing that you just cannot avoid, and it's like, this movie I feel like could make you even more scared of sleep than Freddy Krueger ever could. This also even includes an unnerving bathtub scene, much like A Nightmare on Elm Street as well. So yeah, to be able to tell this story in the way that it wants to be told, but also kind of adding those elements in there also, but not completely, embracing the traditional horror tropes, just kind of throwing them in there to kind of set this vibe a little bit that gives you this sort of classic feel, but also, like I said, brings you into this reality and the clashing of this these fears that come from a very real place from actual reality, with all those also these horror tropes that we've seen in so many movies before, and movies that are totally unbelievable and have hardly anything to do with much of a human element. And that's seeing these come together, I feel like actually creates this whole interesting picture that, like I said, brings the outlandish horror to this very disturbing reality. And I think also the idea of seeing the characters, I said, just kind of be normal, almost be happy. Like we talked about in The Faculty, how we just kind of saw... The Faculty is interesting because it is in this setting that's just kind of bad vibes immediately, where it's like, when we're seeing the introduction of the school, it just seems like everybody's angry and fighting. But at the same time, it's... Like I said, we established the characters enough, like seeing Casey bullied and, you know, seeing the inner workings of Stan. Clea Duvall having a very interesting part, where she's like the... She's a lesbian in real life who's playing a straight person who is pretending to be a lesbian to keep people away. That's very interesting. And then there's Famke Janssen and Jordana Brewster are kind of doing a reverse thing here, where it's like, when you look at Janssen, it's like she's doing, like, she starts off as Daryl Hannah in Steel Magnolias, and she ends up as Daryl Hannah in Kill Bill. And how Jordana Brewster is like kind of the opposite of that, like starts off one way, then ends up the other. And the way you can see kind of things starting to shift. Daniel von Bargen also plays one of the teachers, and it's interesting when we see him in class, and he's just not giving a fuck, and he doesn't remember where the students left off or anything. It's like, because they established the teacher so well at the beginning, it's like you can't even tell if he doesn't know where they are because he's another life form now, or he just never cared that much, which both of them feel likely. So the way they're able to kind of disguise whether, you know, somebody has changed or not is very interesting given the character dynamics. And here it's very interesting, especially because we were talking about the broken home and all that, and how, you know, everybody's kind of not getting along, but we do have the sister, the main character Marty, and the stepbrother who get along quite well. But we also have the parents themselves, the dad, and then the new mom and Meg Tilly. And when we see them just sort of goofing off at first, like in the bedroom, it feels like the scene where we see Craig T. Nelson and Jo Beth Williams getting high in Poltergeist, where it's like it just humanizes them so much. And it's like, what better way to set up the terror of what's going on, to establish that the family is not exactly perfect, but then to make sure they do get humanized before they're anything but human. And then, like, and that's not even to mention the terrifying transformation process of seeing the bodies just sort of rapidly decompose, and then a new one just appear, and just the effect of, you know, the tentacles and the going in the body and all that. Even the inside look is so appropriately disgusting. And it's like, and maybe something, like, it's interesting how almost little of a gross out factor there is in The Faculty, given the fact that we have Rodriguez doing it, but it's like, apart from the Jon Stewart scene where he loses his fingers and then, you know, takes the drugs to the eye, it doesn't really go that over the... Oh, well, there is the, yeah, there is the teacher that, like, loses her scalp in the shower and stuff like that. But, like, as far as, like, the actual transformation process, and how it really goes all in on this one is, like, this creative glory that movie reaches. But as far as coming back to the idea of one taking itself pretty seriously and the other being in this very self-aware territory, this, you know, post-Scream territory from the same writer, we are going to have stuff where, like, you know, Casey's talking about all the movie theories and, like, like, how the existence of movies like, you know, Independence Day and Men in Black and all that other stuff exists in this universe and how they actually connect to what's going on here. There's that whole thing. Then there's, you know, just simple stuff, like, you know, subverting tropes, like when Zeke says, you know, fuck this, I'm out of here, when something starts to get, you know, dangerous. But the thing about it is, this was before self-awareness was played out. Because I would say the self-awareness is pretty played out at this point. I feel like 21 Jump Street, 21 and 22 Jump Street pulled it off, and they pulled it off so well that I think that was about the time That was like kind of the cutoff period where self-awareness started to be too obvious and too easy. And so that's kind of started to wear itself out. But like I said, despite us kind of being in the post-self-awareness era now, the faculty still definitely holds up very well. But it's just the question is, like, nowadays, now that we've had so much self-referential stuff and so much self-awareness, is it more satisfying now to come back to the seriousness of something like Body Snatchers? And it's not even to say, because you could also say that, you know, there's an entertainment value to the faculty that's much bigger. You could say that the faculty's more fun. And sure, I wouldn't disagree with that. But that's not to take away from an entertainment value in Body Snatchers. And like I said, especially from a director like Ferrara to find, you know, an entertainment value while also playing this very straight. There is very, like, the thrill factor in it, and the way it does establish its scares and does them very effectively. And the way that they don't set in right away. When I say scares, like, that kind of sets up, you know, a different idea. But like you said, the way it settles in, and it's like as the further it goes on, the more like scares that have been marinating for a while for the entire first half are starting to like settle in as we get to the second half. And there's something thrilling about that. And when you get to a feeling like that, there's going to be an entertainment value to it. That's why people watch horror movies. That's the whole thing. So, yeah, so I mean, if I were to say, you know, like, there's one that I come back to more often, it's definitely The Faculty. But I certainly don't think Body Snatchers should be, you know, written off for taking itself as seriously as it does. Like I said, that can be kind of, nowadays, with, you know, more cynical outlooks and stuff like that, and this, you know, embracing of self-awareness and self-referential stuff, sometimes stuff can get lost that actually takes itself, like, really seriously. And I really don't think that should be the case, but I'd like to think we're kind of coming back around to appreciating stuff that, you know, can do that approach. But like I said, I don't... It's interesting that the stuff that did the self-referential stuff well, they still hold up. So there's something to that also, but yeah. So I would say... I guess I'd almost go as far as to say Body Snatchers would be objectively better just because it's, you know, significantly scarier, I guess, the way it, like, really settles in. But there's still this factor, like, there's still, you know, suspenseful moments throughout the faculty, like, you know, when they have to walk through the crowd, pretending that they've changed. There's the test scene that's kind of like an ode to the Thing. There's that. There's the scene where a character's trapped on the bus. Those moments are in there also, and the idea of, like, the whole thing just sort of spreading like a virus just very, very quickly. That's something that's here, but that's also something you can find in all the variations of this story. But yeah, so like I said, I'm more likely to watch The Faculty again, like, over. I've already seen it over and over and over again, but it's the one I'm more likely to come back to when I'm looking for a movie like this. Like I said, we'll talk about the others probably eventually. But like I said, Body Snatchers should definitely be appreciated for what it is and the approach that it takes. And like I said, how it takes all these, you know, real elements and is able to add the horror to them. And able to take these aspects of reality and amplify the horror. So, but I think both are very well done. So I think that's how I feel about these. So... we're still, you know, catching up on some October stuff. Now we're going to kind of go into... We're going to get a couple of reviews, like the Todd Field movies and Black Adam and stuff like that. But we're also going to do... there's going to be a couple of animal-based, I guess you could say, verses like this. And I kind of consider those sort of companion versus, like, you know, Wolf and Bad Moon and these two. So we'll have that, and then we'll go on. There's a few more things also. Cronenberg's going to come back, and Argento will be in here. Carpenter will be in here. So that's something to look forward to. So and we're going to finish out Mr. Mercedes and get to The Outsider as well. Somehow. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.